Imagine an age just buzzing with the thrill of the unknown, Wisters of the East, spices, silks, incredible riches driving people to sail off the edge of the map.
Exactly. And today we're diving right into that. Specifically, the voyages of a man whose name everyone knows, but maybe not the full story. Christopher Columbus.
Right. We've got this detailed account in front of us looking at his 4 big transatlantic voyages. We're talking 1492 right through to 1504.
And these weren't just boat trips. They fundamentally kicked off European discovery, colonization, the whole reshaping of the Americas, a massive turning point.
4 journeys that changed everything, 92, 93, and 1502. Our source here lays out the basics, dates, places, who was involved, and crucially, the consequences, the ripples from these voyages.
Yeah, and our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to pull out the really important stuff, the surprising bits from this record, help you get a real handle on this pivotal time without, drowning in every single detail.
Okay, let's jump in. Voyage number 1, 1492. What was the spark? Why this westward quest?
Well, Columbus, he's a Genoese navigator, right?
Yeah.
And he's really fired up by Marco Polo's Tales of Asia. But there's a practical problem. The fall of Constantinople in 1453. That basically slams the door on the old land routes to the east.
Ah, the Ottomans controlling the trade routes.
Yeah.
So getting spices, silks, all that valuable stuff became much harder.
Exactly. Suddenly, Europe needs a new way to get to India, China, Japan, the Spice Islands. It's a huge economic driver.
So not just pure exploration then. It's about trade, fundamentally.
Oh, absolutely. You've got Portugal already making serious headway, controlling routes around Africa into the Indian Ocean. Spain, meanwhile, Isabella and Ferdinand, they've just finished the Reconquista.
Right, reclaiming the Iberian Peninsula.
But you're looking around thinking, how do we compete with Portugal's dominance? Columbus comes along with this westward idea, and they see a potential, shortcut, a way to challenge Portugal.
Okay, but this plan, this idea of sailing west to get east, it wasn't exactly based on pinpoint accurate geography, was it?
That's a really crucial piece. Columbus made some pretty big mistakes about the Earth's size. He seriously underestimated how big the planet actually is.
Really? How off was he?
Quite a bit. He was relying on older calculations, like from Marinus of Tyre, and kind of misinterpreted others, like Alfraganus. He genuinely believed Asia was way closer across the Atlantic than it is. His whole premise was shaky, geographically speaking.
Wow, so a massive miscalculation actually fuels this world-changing journey. That's kind of wild.
In a way, yeah. But it wasn't all error. He did understand some important things about Atlantic winds.
Okay.
He planned to sail southwest to the Canaries first, catch the northeast trade winds. Those would reliably push him west. Smart.
And the return.
For the return, he planned to sail further north to catch the westerlies blowing back towards Europe. It's a technique the Portuguese had already figured out called the volta do mar.
Right, the turn of the sea.
Exactly. So, it's a mix, flawed geography, but some pretty sound nautical strategy, too.
Okay, that makes sense. Even with the map mistakes, there was some real sailing knowledge there. But getting the money, the backing, that couldn't have been easy.
No, definitely not. Experts in Portugal had already looked at his numbers and said, hang on, this distance seems way too short. Later, a Spanish committee basically said the same thing in practical.
So why did Spain eventually say yes?
Well, they didn't completely shut him down. They gave him a small allowance, maybe just to keep him around, keep the option open. But it wasn't until after the Reconquista finished that Isabella and Ferdinand were really ready to take the gamble.
And then came the capitulations of Santa Fe. Those sound important. The terms he got were pretty amazing if he succeeded, right?
Oh, incredibly generous. If he pulls it off, he gets named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, Governor of any new lands. Plus, get this, 10% of all the revenues forever. And rights to nominate officials.
Wow. That sounds like they weren't totally convinced he'd succeed, offering the moon for a long shot.
That's probably a fair reading. Huge rewards for a very, very uncertain venture. It shows you the stakes, I guess.
Talk about high risk, high reward. And the ships. Not exactly a giant fleet for this first trip.
No, not at all. Just 3 small vessels. The Santa Maria, that was a slightly larger carrack. Columbus's flagship, captained by Juan de la Cosa.
Okay.
And then 2 smaller, nippier caravels. The Pinta and the Nina. They were captained by the Pinzon brothers, Martin Alonso and Vicente Yanez. They all set off from Palos on August 3rd, 1492.
Did things go smoothly right from the start? I feel like I remember some early hiccups.
You're right. Pretty early on, the Pinta's rudder broke. They had to stop in the Canary Islands for repairs.
Ah.
And while they were there, they actually re-rigged the Niña too, swapped her lateen sails for square ones, which were thought to be better for sailing straight across the Atlantic with the trade winds. They didn't leave the Canaries heading west until September 6th.
Okay, and our source mentions Columbus kept 2 different logs of the distance. Why would he do that?
Yeah, the common theory is that one log showed the real distance, or what he thought was the real distance. The other one, the one he showed the crew, recorded shorter distances.
To keep them from panicking.
Pretty much. Sailing into the total unknown, imagine weeks going by, no land. Keeping morale up, stopping a potential mutiny. That was probably the idea behind it. A bit of psychological management.
Clever, in a way.
Yeah.
And he made some observation about his compass, too.
Yes, around September 13th, he noted the compass needle wasn't pointing exactly at the North Star anymore. Now, people sometimes say he discovered magnetic declination, but that's not quite right. The phenomenon was already known in Europe, even earlier in China.
But still, out there in the middle of nowhere, seeing your compass do something unexpected must have been unsettling.
Absolutely. Anything breaking the rules you thought you knew would add to the tension. But then finally, signs of land started appearing.
Ah, the famous signs. What were they seeing?
Well, after nearly a month, 29 days straight, without seeing anything but water, they started spotting big flocks of birds flying southwest. That was a huge clue.
Right, birds heading somewhere.
Exactly. So Columbus actually changed course, followed the birds. Then they started seeing things floating in the water, bits of wood, reeds, stuff that looked like it came from land. Hope must have surged.
But the tension was still there. Wasn't there almost a mutiny around this time?
Yes, very nearly. On October 10th, after weeks and weeks, some of the crew had just had enough. Fear, desperation. They demanded they turn back.
How did Columbus handle that?
It was apparently a close call. He had to use everything: persuasion, promising rewards, probably some stern commands too. He managed to convince them to sail on for just a few more days.
And literally 2 days later.
Bang. Land. October 12th, 1492. An absolutely incredible moment.
Who actually saw it first? Does the credit go to Columbus?
Well, the history books usually credit Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor on the Pinta. He's the one said to have shouted, "Tierra, tierra, land, land." But Columbus later claimed he had seen a light the night before but hadn't said anything. And because of that claim, he ended up getting the lifetime pension the monarchs had promised to whoever spotted land first.
That tells you something, doesn't it? Even in that huge moment. So where did they actually land?
The first island they landed on, Columbus named San Salvador. He thought it was one of the outlying islands of the Indies, you see. The local people called it Guanahani.
And where is that today?
There's still a bit of debate, but the most likely candidate is modern-day San Salvador Island in the Bahamas, their first steps in the Americas.
And his first impressions. When he met the indigenous people there, the Lucayan, Taino, Arawak peoples, what did he write down?
His journal gives us a glimpse, though obviously through his own lens. He noted their appearance, that they were mostly naked. He saw scars, which he guessed were from fighting with people from other islands, maybe slave raids, he thought.
And their nature.
He described them as, well, simple, peaceful, seemingly gentle, not having weapons like European ones. And this is key. He immediately saw them as potential converts to Christianity. And he also wrote, right from the start, about taking some of them back to Spain.
And this is where the name Indians comes from, right? Because he thought he was in the Indies.
Exactly. He was convinced he'd reach the East Indies off Asia. So he called the people Indios, Spanish for Indians. That mistake stuck, which is why we still talk about the West Indies for the Caribbean.
And it wasn't just observation, was it? He took people captive pretty quickly.
Almost immediately, yeah. He took several Arawak individuals prisoner. The stated reason was to get them to guide him to where the gold was. That was already the top priority. He noted how easily they could be subjugated. It really shows his mindset from the get-go, seeing people and land as resources to be claimed and used.
Not exactly a meeting of equals. From San Salvador, he sailed on Cuba, Hispaniola. Some big things happened there.
Yes, he explored along the coast of Cuba, which he insisted was mainland China, by the way. Then he went over to Hispaniola, the island that's now Haiti, and the Dominican Republic.
And that's where the Santa Maria...
Tragically, yes. On Christmas Day, 1492, the Santa Maria ran aground and was wrecked. Couldn't be saved.
So what did they do?
With help from a local Taino chief, Guacanagari, they used the timbers from the wreck to build a small fort. He called it La Navidad Christmas. He had to leave 39 of his men behind there when he sailed back.
And they encountered resistance somewhere, too.
On the Samana Peninsula, on Hispaniola, they met the Saguayos. Unlike the Taino they'd met earlier, These guys fought back with bows and arrows. A brief, violent skirmish, Columbus named the place the Bay of Arrows.
It feels like even then, European ideas were coloring how they interpreted things.
Oh, definitely. The locals told stories about other islands, some with people who supposedly ate human flesh, likely the Caribs, and another island just of women called Matanino. Columbus immediately thought, this sounds like stuff Marco Polo wrote about. It just confirmed his belief he was in Asia.
So time to head back. Was the return journey easier?
Not at all. It was rough. A massive storm hit in the Atlantic, separating the Nina and the Pinta. The crew on the Nina were terrified, making vows, praying for deliverance.
Where did they first make land?
They ended up in the Azores, on Santa Maria Island, but that wasn't straightforward either. The Portuguese governor there was suspicious, thought they might be pirates, and actually arrested the first shore party.
Seriously, after all that?
Yep. Columbus had to basically bluff and threaten to get his men released. Then another storm forced the Nina into Lisbon, Portugal.
Awkward. Meeting the Portuguese king.
Very awkward. King John II, who had turned Columbus down years before, now questioned if this whole voyage violated the existing treaty they had with Spain, the Treaty of Alcasovas, about who could explore where. Diplomatic trouble brewing already.
So even before he got back to Spain, his discoveries were causing international ripples. Not everyone was cheering.
That's right. He finally made it back to Palos, where he started, on March 15th, 1493. Then it was off to Barcelona to report to Ferdinand and Isabella.
The big presentation. What did he bring back to show them? What was the proof?
He laid out what he had. Small bits of gold, some pearls, jewelry worn by the natives, and the people he brought back, several of the Taino he'd kidnapped.
What else?
New plants no one in Europe had seen, tobacco, pineapples, turkeys, and chili peppers ají, which he called a type of pepper more potent than the black pepper they knew. But, crucially, no cloves, no nutmeg, none of the really valuable East Indies spices they were hoping for.
But he still insisted he'd reach Asia. How did he sell it?
Absolutely. In the letter he wrote, which got published and spread like wildfire across Europe, he doubled down. Insisted he'd reach the outskirts of Asia. He seriously exaggerated the gold, talked to him how easy it would be to convert the natives. That letter basically created the initial buzz, the sensation.
And people bought it. The monarchs. The Pope.
Largely, yes. The Spanish monarchs were certainly convinced, or wanted to be. Pope Alexander VI also seems to have initially accepted Columbus's version. But it's worth noting some thinkers, like Peter Martyr, were already suggesting maybe this wasn't Asia at all, but a new globe, something entirely different.
Fascinating. And this belief, this initial interpretation, led to some huge political moves, right? Dividing up the world.
Immediately. Based on Columbus's claims, the Pope issued these papal bulls granting Spain rights to the lands discovered. Then came the really big one, the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Spain and Portugal basically drew a line down the Atlantic on the map. Spain got the rights to claim lands west of the line, Portugal to the east, all based on this first voyage.
Okay, let's move to the second voyage, starting in 1493. This is a much bigger deal than the first one, wasn't it? Different goals, too.
Oh, massively different. 17 ships this time, not just 3. The stated aim was primarily the conversion of the native peoples to Christianity. The monarchs actually gave specific instructions to treat them well, maintain friendly relations.
17 ships. That's a statement. What kind of ships?
A mix. Bigger cargo ships, naos like the Mar Galante, several caravels, including the trusty Nina again. And significantly, they carried not just sailors, but colonists, soldiers, priests, horses, livestock, seeds, everything needed to establish a real, permanent Spanish presence. They left Cadiz in September 93.
Where do they make landfall this time?
They arrived in the Lesser Antilles Dominica first, then explored Marie Galante, Guadeloupe. They sailed through and named many of the islands we know today, Montserrat, Antigua, St. Croix, the Virgin Islands.
And this is where they first encountered the Carib people in a significant way, different from the Taino.
Yes, and the encounters were immediately more confrontational. On Guadeloupe, and especially on St. Croix, they found evidence that seemed to confirm the Taino stories about Carib cannibalism and warfare, like captive boys being castrated.
And violence erupted.
It did. On St. Croix, there was a skirmish. Europeans and Caribs were killed and captured. And we have this really disturbing account from one of the men, Michel de Cuneo.
Oh, yeah.
He wrote quite openly about capturing a Caribbean, intending to keep her as a slave and beating and raping her when she resisted. It's brutal, and it really starkly illustrates the violence and the mindset of conquest taking hold.
That's grim. A very different picture from the initial descriptions of peaceful encounters. What about Puerto Rico?
They reached Puerto Rico Borinquen, the
Yes.
natives called it. Columbus named it San Juan Bautista. There, a Taino woman and boy who'd been Carib captives actually escaped to the Spanish ships. They also rescued some other boys the Caribs had apparently been keeping to eat. This reinforced the Spanish view. Taino, good victims, Caribs, bad cannibals.
Then back to Hispaniola to check on the men left at La Navidad. What did they find?
Disaster. As they approached the area, they found bodies, some clearly European. They couldn't find any survivors from the fort.
What happened?
They eventually learned from Guacanagari, the local chief who'd been friendly before, that the fort had been wiped out. Attacked by another, more powerful chief named Caonabo. Apparently, the Spaniards left behind had abused the local Taíno, stealing gold, taking women, and Caonabo retaliated. The fort was burned, all 39 men killed.
So the first attempt at settlement ended in total failure and bloodshed. That must have been a huge blow.
A massive blow, and it completely changed the dynamic. Any illusion of easy coexistence was shattered. This led Columbus to establish a new settlement further east along the coast, La Isabela.
La Isabela, the first proper European town in the Americas.
Pretty much. From there, they started exploring inland, looking for gold. Built a small fort in the interior. Columbus also sailed off again to explore more of Cuba, still convinced it was China and Jamaica.
But his main idea of setting up trading posts like in Asia, that wasn't panning out, obviously.
No, because there was no Great Khan, no established cities like he expected. And back in Hispaniola, things were already going badly wrong within the Spanish community itself.
How so?
You have figures like Alonso de Ojeda leading expeditions inland for gold. He captured some natives accused of theft and, just like that, ordered their ears cut off. Columbus himself, as governor, imposed really harsh discipline, including executions and mutilations, not just on natives, but on rebellious Spaniards, too.
And life was tough for the average Spanish settler.
Extremely tough. La Isabela was plagued by disease stuff the Europeans had no immunity to. Food was scarce. They weren't equipped for tropical agriculture, and their presence disrupted the natives' own food production. This hardship just fueled more desperation and more brutality towards the Taino as colonists tried to force them to provide food and labor.
Columbus tried sharing power with a guy named Margaret. Did that help?
Not really. Pedro Margaret was put in charge of military campaigns inland, supposedly focused on conversion. But his men ran rampant beatings, rape, enslavement became widespread. Columbus apparently clashed with them over it, but Margaret and a priest, Fray Bill, end up sailing back to Spain anyway.
And what did he tell the king and queen?
They complained bitterly about Columbus and his brothers, probably exaggerating the lack of gold and painting a picture of chaos and mismanagement. Meanwhile, the soldiers left behind under Margaret just continued terrorizing the Taino.
This sounds like a descent into chaos and exploitation. The tribute system. That sounds particularly awful.
It was horrific. In 1495, after putting down some native resistance, he rounded up maybe 1,500 Arawaks. Enslaving many, Columbus imposed this system. Every single native adult, basically, had to provide a certain amount of gold dust or cotton every few months.
How could they enforce that?
They gave out copper tokens. You had to wear your token to show you'd paid your tribute. If you were caught without it or hadn't met the quota, punishment was severe. Mutilation, execution.
But was there even that much gold?
In many areas, no. The quotas were impossible. It led to mass despair. People fled to the mountains. There were reports of mass suicides. The system was incredibly cruel and ultimately unsustainable. It collapsed within a couple of years, but the damage was immense.
And Columbus himself was involved in hunting people down.
Yes. After recovering from an illness, he led campaigns to track down natives who had fled the forced labor. Killings, more mutilations. It was brutal suppression.
So the second voyage ends with Columbus heading back to Spain in 1496, leaving Hispaniola in a terrible state.
Absolutely. The return trip itself was difficult, low on supplies, more conflict on Guadeloupe, just trying to get food. He arrived back in Cadiz in June 96, leaving behind a colony ravaged by disease, internal conflict, and a devastating relationship with the native population. He faced serious questions back in Spain about his leadership.
Right, let's shift to the third voyage, 1498. This one had a different goal again, suggesting maybe the picture was starting to change.
Yes, this time the objective was quite specific. Check out rumors of a large landmass, a continent south or southwest of the Caribbean islands he already knew.
Where did that idea come from?
Apparently King John II of Portugal mentioned it, based on stories of seeing canoes far out at sea that seemed to have come from Guinea in Africa, suggesting they might have drifted west to another land. So Columbus set off from Sanlúcar in May 98 with 6 ships. 3 went straight to Hispaniola with supplies. He took the other 3 south.
He sailed much further south this time.
Yeah, way south.
Yeah.
Past Madeira, the Canaries, down to the Cape Verde Islands off Africa. Then he sailed southwest into the infamous doldrums.
The doldrums. Bad news for sailing ships.
Terrible news. Intense heat, no wind for days. It damaged the ship, spoiled food and water. A really difficult passage.
But then, landfall. Something significant.
Huge. On July 31st, 1498, they sighted an island with 3 peaks. He named it Trinidad. And the very next day, August 1st, they saw the coast of South America, the delta of the Orinoco River.
The mainland. Did he realize what it was?
He realized it was massive. The sheer volume of fresh water coming from the Orinoco told him this couldn't be just another island. He called it an other world. But remarkably, he still tried to fit it into his Asian theory. Maybe this was part of the Malay Peninsula, or even, he speculated, near the location of the biblical earthly paradise.
Still clinging to that Asia idea, where did they land?
They landed briefly on Trinidad, then crossed the strait, the Serpent's Mouth, he called it, into the Gulf of Paria, between Trinidad and Venezuela. They landed on the Paria Peninsula itself, his first steps on the South American continent.
And his health by this point.
It was starting to fail. He was suffering from eye problems, possibly arthritis. While he was unwell, other captains took formal possession of the land. They traded with local people, got some pearls, saw they drink a kind of maize wine. He realized they were in a huge gulf, confirming the scale of the landmass.
And he came up with a strange theory about the Earth's shape around this time.
Yeah. Based on some faulty astronomical observations, he measured the North Star's movement incorrectly. He developed this odd idea that the Earth wasn't perfectly round, but shaped like a pear, with the earthly paradise located on the stem end where he thought he was.
A pear-shaped Earth. Okay, so after exploring there, he headed back towards Hispaniola.
Yes, he sailed out of the Gulf of Paria, sighted Tobago and Grenada, and then made for Hispaniola. But he arrived back to find the colony in absolute chaos.
Worse than when he left.
Much worse. Open rebellion. The colonists were furious, claiming Columbus had lied about the riches, that they'd been abandoned. They were writing back to Spain, complaining directly to the crown. Columbus tried to restore order, even hang some of his own crew for disobedience, but the situation was out of control.
And the conflict over enslaving natives was still a major issue.
A huge issue. Columbus saw enslavement as a potential source of profit, especially since gold wasn't as plentiful as hoped. He wrote about sending enslaved people back to Spain to be sold. This directly clashed with some of the clergy who were arguing for conversion and, basic humanity.
So the crown had to step in.
Eventually, yes. The rebellion, led by a man named Francisco Roldan, couldn't be contained. Columbus was forced to make peace with the rebels on pretty humiliating terms. But the complaints reaching Spain were overwhelming. In 1500, the monarch sent a royal commissioner, Francisco de Bobadilla, with full powers to investigate.
And this was the end for Columbus as governor.
Absolutely. Bobadilla arrived, listened to the flood of complaints against Columbus and his brothers, and acted decisively. He stopped executions Columbus had ordered, seized Columbus's property, and crucially, arrested Christopher, Diego, and Bartolomeo Columbus.
Arrested.
Yeah. Arrested and put in chains. Bobadilla shipped them back to Spain in disgrace in October 1500. Meanwhile, Vasco da Gama had successfully sailed around Africa to India, opening up that sea route Portugal controlled. Columbus's westward route seemed less important, and his management of Hispaniola was seen as a disaster.
What a downfall.
Yeah.
And earlier, Columbus had actually asked for more settlers, even pardoned criminals.
Yeah, trying to populate the colony, he'd asked for farmers, artisans, and yes, he'd gotten permission to offer pardons to criminals if they'd serve in Hispaniola. But more people didn't solve the underlying problems of mismanagement and rebellion. His execution of one rebel leader just made things worse. He was exhausted physically and mentally by the time Bobadilla arrived.
So Bobadilla takes over. Here's all the complaints.
Right. He launched an official inquiry, gathering testimony mostly from the rebels, of course. Accusations flew, forced labor, cruelty to Spaniards and natives alike, hiding gold. Bobadilla suspended the tribute system, confiscated Columbus's wealth. The whole thing was a complete repudiation of Columbus's authority.
Back to Spain in chains. That must have been the absolute low point. But he wasn't imprisoned for long.
No, only about 6 weeks. King Ferdinand ordered their release. Maybe worried about the public image, maybe still valuing Columbus's discoveries. They were summoned to the court at the Alhambra in Granada.
How did that go?
Apparently, it was quite emotional. Columbus pleaded his case, admitted some faults, wept. The monarchs freed them, promised his property would be returned. But, and this is key, they did not reinstate him as governor. That job went to Nicolas de Ovando y Cáceres. Columbus kept his titles, admiral, viceroy, but the real power was gone.
Yet somehow, he convinced them to fund one more voyage. A fourth one.
Amazingly, yes. He was still obsessed with finding that strait, the passage to the Indian Ocean that he believed must be somewhere nearby. He argued his case, and they agreed to fund a final, fourth expedition.
What was the main goal officially?
To find the Strait of Malacca, basically. Get to the Spice Islands the back way. But there is a catch. Strict orders not to stop at Hispaniola on the way out. They clearly wanted to avoid any more drama with Ovando and the situation there.
So Voyage 4, starting 1502. This one sounds like it was plagued by disaster from the start.
Pretty much. He set off from Cadiz in May 1502. 4 ships, about 147 men. His teenage son Ferdinand was with him, which is why we have a good account of it. Also his brother Bartholomew and the loyal Diego Mendes.
They made a quick stop in Morocco.
Briefly, yeah, to help some Portuguese soldiers under siege. Then a fast crossing to Martinique in the Caribbean.
And then he immediately disobeyed orders, headed for Hispaniola.
He did. He claimed one of his ships needed repairs, but more importantly, he said he had a premonition, basically, of a massive hurricane coming. He wanted shelter in Santo Domingo's harbor.
And Ovando, the governor?
Refused him entry. Still bitter, probably following his own orders, too. Told Columbus to stay away.
And the hurricane.
It hit, exactly as Columbus apparently predicted. A monster storm. And here's the kicker. Ovando had just sent a large fleet back to Spain loaded with gold, including Columbus's confiscated gold and carrying Bobadilla and Roldan, Columbus's main enemies.
Oh, no.
Most of that fleet sank. Bobadilla, Roldan, hundreds of others drowned. Columbus's ships, having found shelter elsewhere along the coast, survived. His enemies actually accused him of using magic to summon the storm.
Incredible twist of fate. So after the storm, where did Columbus go?
He regrouped and sailed west, eventually reaching the coast of Central America near modern Honduras in July 1502.
Central America, what did they find there?
Off an island called Guanacha, they encountered a huge dugout canoe, much more sophisticated than anything they'd seen in the islands. It was full of cargo textiles, copper tools, cacao beans, probably Mayan traders.
Right.
This was the first European contact with cacao.
Cacao. And he still thought he was near.
The Ganges. He apparently talked to an old man who told him about people nearby with swords and horses, maybe rumors of other Spaniards, and that the Ganges River wasn't far. He then landed on the mainland near Trujillo, Honduras, and spent months sailing south along the coasts of Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, desperately searching for that strait.
Did he find any clues? Anything promising?
In Panama, in Almirante Bay, he heard tales from the natives about a place called Siguare. Rich in gold, civilized people, bordered another sea, and near the Ganges, of course. This might have been the first hint he got of the Pacific Ocean, but again, he framed it in Asian terms.
More hardship. Storms.
Terrible storms. His journal describes one in December 1502 that lasted for days, thought they were finished. Then further south in Panama, near the Belen River, he heard more about a narrow strip of land leading to another ocean. He decided to set up a garrison there in January 1503.
How did that go?
Badly. Conflict erupted almost immediately with the local Guaymi people, led by a chief called El Quibian. The Spanish post was attacked, men were killed, ships were damaged by shipworms. It wasn't sustainable.
So they had to abandon that too. Where next?
They had to leave. In April 1503, they limped away, heading back towards Hispaniola. Their remaining 2 ships were barely seaworthy, riddled with holes from shipworms. They sighted the Cayman Islands, called them Las Tortugas, for all the turtles. But the ships were failing fast.
This leads to the shipwreck.
Yes. Off the coast of Cuba, they were hit by another storm. The ships were taking on too much water. In June 1503, with no other option, Columbus ran them aground side by side in a bay in Jamaica, St. Anne's Bay. Stranded.
Stranded in Jamaica for how long?
For over a year. An incredible ordeal.
How did they even survive? How did they get help?
Survival depended initially on trading with the local Taino people for food. For rescue, the hero was Diego Mendes. He and another man made an unbelievably dangerous journey in a dugout canoe, paddling across 100 miles of open sea to Hispaniola to get help.
But Ovando didn't rush to help.
No. Ovando basically blocked any rescue attempt for months, maybe out of spite, maybe political calculation. Meanwhile, back in Jamaica,
Yes.
Columbus famously used his knowledge of astronomy. He knew a lunar eclipse was coming. He had an almanac. He predicted it to the Taino, saying his god was angry they weren't providing enough food. When the eclipse happened, the terrified Taino resumed supplying the Spaniards. Clever, eh?
Very clever. But things weren't peaceful among the Spaniards themselves.
No, tensions boiled over. A mutiny broke out, led by the Porras brothers, who felt Columbus was keeping them there. It ended in an actual sword fight between the Loyalists, led by Columbus's brother Bartholomew, and the rebels. Bartholomew won.
Finally, rescue.
Finally, after Mendez persistently lobbied, a caravel was eventually sent from Hispaniola and arrived in June 1504. Of the 147 men who started the voyage, only 110 were still alive. Some chose to stay in Hispaniola rather than go back with Columbus.
And Columbus himself, he made it back to Spain.
He and his son Ferdinand sailed back, arriving in Sanlúcar in November 1504. That was the end of his exploring days. He died about 18 months later.
So 4 voyages. He never found the route to Asia he was looking for. But the impact, it was immense, wasn't it?
Absolutely immense. His voyages didn't discover America in the sense that people weren't already there,
Yeah.
obviously, but they triggered the wave of European exploration, colonization, the whole Columbian exchange.
Right, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, people, ideas, back and forth across the Atlantic. Changed the world, often seen as the start of the modern era, really.
Exactly. And his early views, about the natives being docile, easily converted, but also suitable for enslavement, those ideas had terrible, long-lasting impacts.
The second voyage really marked the start of major conflict, didn't it? Since the Vikings, anyway.
Yes. Sustained conflict, violence, including sexual violence. And the formal Spanish policies that followed, like the forced settlements, the reductions starting in 1503, completely upended indigenous societies. And don't forget the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal back in 1494, setting the stage for colonial empires.
And even though Columbus died still believing he'd reached Asia, others quickly figured it out.
Pretty quickly, yeah. Amerigo Vespucci's voyages led to the understanding that this was a whole new continent. That's why it ended up being called America on maps from 1507 onwards, although the mapmaker later had second thoughts.
And then Balboa sees the Pacific, Magellan's expedition sails around the world, the true picture emerges.
Right. And Spain moves on to conquering the Aztec and Inca empires, helped hugely by indigenous allies and devastating European diseases. Their focus shifted heavily to extracting gold and silver, all stemming from those initial voyages.
It's quite a story. So, wrapping this up, what are the big takeaways from looking closely at Columbus's voyages?
Well, you see this figure of incredible ambition, flawed vision, maybe. His journeys, based partly on error, utterly transformed the world for better and for worse. They launched an age of European dominance, but also unleashed immense suffering. It's that complex legacy, explorer and initiator of conquest.
And the surprising details, things people might not realize.
Maybe just how much of a gamble it was for Spain initially, driven by that rivalry with Portugal. The mix of surprisingly sophisticated navigation, those wind patterns alongside the huge geographical mistakes, the complexity of the encounters with different indigenous groups, not just passive victims, the sheer brutality and hardship faced by everyone involved, including the Europeans. And of course, Columbus's stubborn refusal right to the end to accept he hadn't reached Asia.
Okay, final thought then. It really strikes you. This massive global shift, it all kicked off because of a mix of what? Ambition, miscalculation, religious fervor, the hunger for wealth, all colliding. Thinking about how those threads wove together to create a world so different from what anyone, especially Columbus, expected. What does that make you think about how we look back on these huge historical turning points?
That's the crux, isn't it? How do you evaluate an event, a person that was so world-changing but also so devastating for so many? It forces you, I think, to confront the complexity, to see how noble goals, or at least stated noble goals like conversion, could coexist with brutal exploitation, how discovery and destruction could be two sides of the same coin. It challenges us to understand the motivations, the context, but not excuse the consequences. Thinking about Columbus really pushes you to grapple with the messy, often uncomfortable reality of how our modern world came to be.